Hello, everyone. My name is Axel Eriksson. I'm part of the Gibbon Steering Committee and also part of the coordination team for Gibbon Europe, and finally also a member of the Gibbon policy team. And what I will talk about now is the agenda item of cooperation with other conventions and international organizations. So to begin with, which types of other organizations are we talking about? Well, there's an ecosystem of actors, I would say. So only within the UN, you can see here to the right in the figure that there are a lot of different branches of the UN. And in particular, there are three different conventions called the Rio Conventions, which I will be going into quite soon. There are then other biodiversity related conventions, which are not these three Rio Conventions. There is the Food and Agriculture Organizations in the UN, which deals with you know, the food and agricultural aspects of biodiversity, for example. And the UN Environment Program, which has quite a broad mandate relating to environmental issues, including biodiversity. But aside from the UN, there are also intergovernmental organizations such as IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, which has governments as members. So these are also included in this agenda item. There are NGOs, like non-governmental organizations, which work at the international level. For example, WWF or Conservation International. There are many different ones. There are also businesses. So there are a lot of different actors who are involved in biodiversity internationally somehow. And you might wonder, when there are different UN conventions, there are separate bodies, but the UN consists of member states, right? And aren't the same member states signing all these different conventions? So why are there different decisions in different bodies within the UN? So this is a bit complex, but in brief, one reason is that not all governments choose to sign all the different conventions or treaties. So for the CBD, one notable example is that the US, the United States of America, haven't signed the CBD, but they have signed the Climate Convention, and that means that they might agree to something in the Climate Convention, whereas the CBD would agree to something else with which, if the US were a member of the CBD, they would not have agreed to. So that's also one reason that sometimes the different governments are signing the different treaties. And also mandate is quite important. So when countries are discussing something at the UN conference, they want to know what they have agreed to discuss. So in the CBD, it's very clear that here we'll be dealing with biodiversity, and things which don't relate to biodiversity would probably not be decided upon here. So when the governments come into this biodiversity conference, they are very clear on what can they expect, and um, that is quite important, so that basically if something climate related comes up, they know that okay, we don't have to deal with this here. Um, and then a third reason is that one body of the UN cannot decide how another body should decide, even if the same governments would be part of them. So this means that if there's a decision on climate and biodiversity at the same time, a decision which, so to speak, is cross-cutting across biodiversity and climate, the CBD cannot decide that the UN Climate Convention should decide something on this. The CBD can decide something on its own, and then the UN Climate Convention can get inspired by the CBD, but the CBD can never tell the UNFCCC, the Climate Convention, that you should decide the same thing as we did. So that's also important to remember. But with this, I would go into a couple of different ways that the CBD collaborates with other conventions. So the first one is the so-called Joint Liaison Group of the Rio Conventions. And these Rio Conventions, there are three of them. They were all founded at the 1992 Earth Summit, which happened in Rio de Janeiro, hence the name Rio Conventions. And these are the CBD, which we know, and then the CCD, the UN Convention on Combating Desertification, and the UNFCCC, the UN Climate Convention. And this joint liaison group is an informal forum for exchanging information, exploring opportunities for synergistic activities, and increasing coordination. Um, and basically this body is made up of the officers of the convention's scientific subsidiary bodies. So these subsidiary bodies have chairs, for example, and the executive secretaries. Each of these three conventions have executive secretaries, who are basically the highest um, staff in the team, and the members of the secretariat. So this is the joint liaison group on the Rio Conventions. Then there is something called the Liaison Group on Biodiversity-related Conventions, a very similar name, but this one is a different body. And the purpose of this one is to enhance coherence and cooperation in implementation of these different conventions. So aside from the three Rio Conventions, there are four others here. Um, so in this liaison group, the heads of the secretariats of these seven different biodiversity-related conventions are represented. So as I said, the Rio Conventions are three of them: CBD, UCCD, and UNFCCC. Then we have the CITES on indigenous species. We have the CMS, migratory species, Ramsar on wetlands, and World Heritage Convention on world heritages. And this body meets regularly to explore opportunities for synergistic activities and increase coordination and to exchange information. So as you note, this one has a quite similar focus as the joint liaison group of the Rio Conventions, but it's constituted differently, and the kind of activities are a bit different, although they have a very similar topic. And then there's something called the Bern process. So one could describe this as the process for cooperation among parties to the relevant biodiversity-related conventions that aims to strengthen cooperation and collaboration, contributing to effective and efficient implementation of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. So this process was basically set up so that different conventions which have some impact on the KMGBF, the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, that they are kind of all working together towards that, so that other conventions than the CBD know what the GBF is and how to implement it. And in this process, the last meeting was in January 2024, called the Bern 3 conference. And in COP16, there's currently a draft recommendation to welcome the report of this Bern conference, basically saying that this is something that's important to the CBD, and therefore we welcome it. And another body, which is interesting, is the UN Environment Management Group. I won't go through much of it, but in brief, it's a body across the UN system, which deals with environment and human settlements. And yeah, that's the general detail I want to go into. There's something called DART, which is the data reporting tool for MEAS, and it is the first tool that supports parties to effectively use synergies in the field of knowledge and information management for national reporting to biodiversity-related conventions. So the reason why I'm mentioning this is that it's often mentioned in the CBD decisions, which might be good to know what this stands for and what it is more specifically. That's the first reason. And then the second reason, we talk a lot in the CBD about indicators and kind of how do we measure biodiversity, what kind of data do we need, gaps in data collection across countries. And therefore, it's quite important to have this coherent way of getting data, which goes across multilateral environmental agreements, MEAS. So this is why it's important, or just a few reasons why it's important. And this tool is developed by UNEP, the New Environment Program, and it has gotten support from the CBD Secretariat, among others. Okay, so now we've gone through a lot of different bodies, but now I want to go through the actual decisions from COP15, and then we'll move into what we can expect for COP16. And here I will be a bit brief for you. You will be able to read detailed positions on this later on, but here I will just provide some context. So from COP15, there were several different decisions relating to this agenda item. The first one was welcoming contributions of other conventions and international organizations. Second one, respecting mandates of other conventions and renewing cooperation. The third and fourth one, encourage support for GBF. So basically, these are the paragraph numbers. Sorry for not clarifying that. And the fifth paragraph is an invitation to the liaison group. Note this is the liaison group between biodiversity-related conventions to give input. Sixth is an encouragement to work with stakeholders at all levels. Seventh to ninth are different invitations to different bodies to enhance synergies with the CBD or the GBF in particular. Number 10 is quite important to us because it urges parties and invites others, which includes youth, to work together to enhance synergies in the GBF. So here, young people are actually mentioned as an actor in enhancing synergies. The 11th to 14th paragraphs relate to the implementation of other conventions. And the 15th one says that subject to the availability of funding and technical support, there will be a couple of key actions, and in particular involving the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues and the UN Permanent Forum of People of African Descent on traditional knowledge issues. And then there are a couple of paragraphs on what the Secretariat should do. And also, I wanted to mention what text on this item actually appeared in this GBF. So in the section on purpose, section B, we have quite a few relevant things here. But in brief, it promotes coherence, complementarity, and cooperation between the convention and other biodiversity-related conventions, other multilateral agreements, and international institutions. And in section C, considerations for the implementation of the framework, it is quite similar. So I won't go through it in detail, but here you can see that they have added the global, regional, sub-regional, and national levels, and also that implementing the GBF should be done in a more efficient and effective manner through these different corporations. So this was a brief overview of the decisions that exist on the topic. For COP16, we can expect a few things. Based on the recommendations from the last subsidiary bottom implementation, SBI, there are a couple of different paragraphs. I will just focus on the more central one. So paragraph number 6 invites the Food and Agriculture Organization and UNEP to implement the GBF, especially Target 2, and that this should be done in consultation with indigenous peoples and local communities, women, youth, persons with disabilities, and other marginalized groups. And then a couple of other paragraphs, whereas paragraph number 11 encourages parties to raise awareness on the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan across ministries nationally. So this is also quite important. The mainstreaming of biodiversity, this is something we as Gibbon have advocated for quite a bit. And then many other paragraphs. Number 18, where among other things, the Secretariat should support the representation of IPLCs, women and youth in implementation and other aspects of basically the cooperation between different conventions. And with this, I also wanted to mention that we as Gibbon and other major groups and other stakeholders have made interventions on the topic. So a very common thread is the importance of policy coherence on cross-cutting issues and across these different bodies which work on biodiversity, and making sure that the relevant conventions and international organizations develop common definitions and policies. And we as youth have in particular raised that when we're talking about collaborations between conventions, we should not only consider synergies, because often there are trade-offs, and these need to be considered and preferably minimized. And the second point from us youth is ensuring implementation happening on the ground. But as I said, you can take part of more detailed positions later on. And with this, I thank you.